Well, Dr. Carmona, that's a very strong statement. It appears that both Dr. Koop and Dr. Satcher both had their ability to be the Surgeon General, to use science, to use the position as a bully pulpit interfered with. But it seems to me what you're saying is that even though you consulted with them, the experience you had was even worse, and it's now at a new magnitude of involvement and interference. Is that the message I should get?
Mr. Chairman, I believe that's correct. As I said in my statement, my first year being somewhat politically naive and as much education as I had and degrees that I eventually accumulated, nothing can prepare you for what you finally come to witness in Washington. And being devoid of a reference point, I sought their good counsel to say, what's going on here? Did you have these problems? And it was Surgeon General Koop who pointed out and still says today, he said to me, Richard, we all have fought these battles, as have our predecessors going back over a century. But we have never seen it as partisan, as malicious, as vindictive, as mean-spirited as it is today, and you clearly have it worse than any of us had.
Well, you tried to fill the role and did a responsible job of trying to provide accurate science-based information, but you indicate that times you were marginalized or simply had your reports or ideas buried. You came in as Surgeon General in 2002, and at that time there was a great national debate about the role of stem cells in medical research. I understand you thought the Surgeon General could play a constructive role in explaining this issue, just the science of it, to the American public. Could you tell us what you tried to do and what the result was?
Yes, Mr. Chairman, I'd be happy to. I recognize that notwithstanding stem cell issues, the nation suffers from health illiteracy. The literature is clear. About a third of the nation really doesn't understand the science we have to deal with every day, doesn't understand the relationship of their behavior to ultimate health outcomes. And I saw this debate going around, not only as a new Surgeon General, but I'd witnessed it as a professor. And I saw that much of the discussion was being moved forward devoid of science. And so I approached leadership to say the Surgeon General should be leaning forward on this. We should be, in fact, engendering debate on this issue so that we make sure the American public, our elected officials, our appointed officials, are all knowledgeable of the science. Much of the discussion was being driven by theology, ideology, preconceived beliefs that are scientifically incorrect. So I thought this is a perfect example of the Surgeon General being able to step forward, educate the American public, as well as elected and appointed officials, so that we can have, if you will, informed consent on an issue to the American public to make better decisions. I was blocked at every turn. I was told the decision had already been made. Stand down, don't talk about it. In speeches initially where that information was put in speeches, it was removed from my speeches.
Who would remove a portion of your speech?
Well, there were people that actually were assigned in the department to vet my speeches, to speechwriters who were helping me put together talking points and things like that. And unfortunately, I was naive enough during my first year that I didn't recognize this was happening. Many of the staff, in trying to protect me, didn't tell me the embattled problems, the positions that they were in trying to help me bring the best science forward, but constantly being vetted and politically vetted, I should say, not scientifically vetted. And it was a while before I figured out that this was happening behind the scenes.
Did you have any of your other speeches vetted and censored?
Repeatedly.
On other topics?
Repeatedly.
Repeatedly?
Yes.
And were these scientists or physicians that were doing it, or political people?
No, in fact, I welcomed input from my colleagues in science. I often called my NIH colleagues in CDC, my officers in other departments to say, what do you think about this? Give me the best science. And I would bring groups together to achieve consensus on a scientific issue. The vetting was done by political appointees who were specifically there to be able to spin, if you will, my words in such a way that would be preferable to a political or an ideologically preconceived notion that had nothing to do with science.
Were you allowed to speak freely to reporters?
No. I was often instructed what to say or what not to say. I did the best I could to speak out on issues. Honestly, I never lied. I never covered the truth. But it was a fine line that I walked all the time, because often the particular issue already had a preconceived political solution, and I had nothing to do with it. And what I found during my first year was that I would see policy moving forward, and I would scratch my head and think, shouldn't the Surgeon General have been involved in this discussion? Yet I'd have nothing to do with it, but yet be expected to support these notions that were released to the press through policy, legislation, and such, yet I've had no input into them prospectively.
The President made a decision on stopping research using embryonic stem cells. He claimed he had a certain number of lines of cells that were already in existence, and he would allow that research to go forward. It may not have been a decision you agreed with, but it was his decision. What do you think your role should be after the President decides for the administration what that administration's policy would be?
Well, Mr. Chairman, I think clearly the President of the United States, as the senior elected official, has the authority to do what he sees fit, as does Congress, as the elected officials representing our citizens. However, I think as part of the due diligence, the Surgeon General should be at the table representing our colleagues in science as it relates to the issue. Make no mistake, I think I speak with my fellow Surgeon Generals on this as well. We recognize that ultimately the authority rests with those elected officials. The danger is when the science is not heard, when the policy, when the ideas are promulgated forward in front of the American public devoid of scientific discussion, where the Surgeon General is marginalized. That's the danger.
Were you going to advance a particular point of view on research, or were you going to simply discuss the science and what it would mean when embryonic stem cells or any other stem cells were used?
Mr. Chairman, I think the Surgeon General walks a fine line there. Certainly have asked by the senior officials to express an opinion as to what appropriate course of action should be. I think that's a perfectly good role for the Surgeon General, but also recognizing that it is ultimately the elected officials and officials who have the authority to make the final decision. So that, had I been asked, my discussion would have been more about the science of stem cells, devoid of the political and ideological banter that was going on, but so that the American public could understand, if you will, the risks, the benefits, the cost of going in a certain direction, and understand the science of stem cells, because that was, I felt, was devoid within these discussions that were mostly being driven politically, ideologically, or theologically.
Was this a unique issue? Did you have experience with the administration, other political appointees in the administration interfering with other discussions on public health?
Well, in speaking with some of my colleagues in other departments, and not only in HHS but in others, there were those complaints from others who felt
I'm talking about you.
Oh, me specifically?
Yeah, Plan B.
Oh, yes, sir.
The emergency contraceptive drug, comprehensive or abstinence-only sex education, those are all matters the public needs to know more about in terms of just the basic science. Were those issues that you tried to speak out about and stopped from discussing as well?
Yes, sir, that's true. On many of those issues, I felt, again, that the Surgeon General should be taking the lead on discussions with the American public on what the science is behind those issues to help the public come to some conclusions as to what course of action they might support, as well as our elected and appointed officials, that they should be aware of the science.
What was the interference? Did they tell you you can't talk about it? Did they review your speeches? Did they edit speeches and remarks to the press, edit reports? What was the way in which you were interfered?
All of the above, sir. All of the above. And for instance, on abstinence education, when that came up, and a lot of my colleagues, as my colleague Surgeon Generals have said, this position of U.S. Surgeon General really has morphed into a global position. I mean, regularly speak with health ministers and leaders from other countries who would call for information, who would ask us questions. And on the abstinence issue, right away I started getting a lot of calls from our colleagues in the United States and even overseas who would say, well, how could you only support abstinence only? That flies in the face of public health science. I said, I don't. I said, if you look at any one of my presentations, it was always about a comprehensive approach to sexual education, largely based on my predecessor David Satcher's work, who had brought that information forward before I came, and I built on that platform. However, there was already a policy in place that did not want to hear the science, but wanted to just, if you will, quote unquote, preach abstinence, which I felt was scientifically incorrect.
Well, I thank you for your comments and responses to these questions. I know many of my colleagues will have further questions of you, but I do think that the Surgeon General has to be independent if the Surgeon General is going to have any credibility. And the credibility of that position is what is the key to the success of the Surgeon Generals that we've had over the years. If my colleagues would just indulge me, I was in the Soviet Union, and I was with some dissidents, and they were smoking cigarettes like crazy. And I asked one of them, don't you have any warnings on your cigarette packs to tell you how dangerous it is? And I was told by one of the dissidents, this is a warning put on by the government. How can you believe anything the government tells you? Well, if it's a government telling you their political point of view, you start not believing anything the government has to say, unless there's some credible, independent, scientific statement which supersedes the politics.
Mr. Chairman, may I just make a comment on that to echo what my colleagues had said? After I got over my political naivete and I started traveling, I had the same experience that Surgeon Generals Koop and Satcher had. As I met with my colleagues in the World Health Organization, as I met with those in the Americas through PAHO, they looked at this Surgeon General position as one of a beacon of hope, one that really represents the best of America as giving truthful information. And I think one of the more perfect examples of that would be, we fought for years to get out that report on secondhand smoke. When it finally got out, because of all of the political manipulations and marginalization, it's out. Within 2 weeks, I had calls from 6 continents, hundreds of cities in our own country. I had small restaurateurs in Texas and El Paso calling and saying, we have the information now, we're going smoke-free in all of my restaurants. I had governments calling me saying, we have information now from the United States Surgeon General that will help us make our city, our country, smoke-free. The ramifications were rippling because of the credibility that your Surgeon General of the United States had for the health of not only the nation but the world.
Thank you very much, Dr. Carmona. Mr.